Good morning and welcome to the Social Justice Forum this morning. My name is Michelle Lavelle Henry and I'm a member of the Social Justice Ministry team. The theme for today's Social Justice Forum, or not today, but for the theme for the year, is investing in each other's future. Through these forums, we aim to learn about opportunities for engagement and action by Westminster members to help ensure all our neighbors thrive, to better understand the structure and systems that have failed many of our neighbors, and to explore ways we can work together to build better outcomes. Today, we are pleased to welcome Gretchen Musicant and Rachel Peterson, members of the Minneapolis Child-Friendly City Initiative. Minneapolis is now one of the 2 U.S. cities to have achieved child-friendly city candidate status. They will address child human rights and the rights of children started in 2005 while volunteering for Save the Children in Norway. After 15 years in the nonprofit sector in Norway and Minnesota, Rachel joined the Office of Justice Programs at the state of Minnesota. Gretchen was the Minneapolis Commissioner of Health for 18 years until her retirement in 2021. The well-being of children and youth have been a long interest, beginning professionally when she was a nurse on a pediatric unit. Before we start, we have a couple of items. For those attending in person in the Miser Room, raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you. Including those on the live stream, we can hear your questions and comments, and Beth Gillespie will be so kind to enter those into the forum. For those attending in the live stream, submit your questions in the chat. With that, please welcome Rachel and Gretchen.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm so lucky to have Rachel with me because we've been on this journey now since, I think, 2019, this particular journey. So I wanted to start today with asking you to use your imagination a little bit. So the title of this talk today is Centering Children and Youth in Decision Making. And so what I want you to do is to try and imagine that overnight, while you were sleeping and it was raining, everything changed. And children's and youth's voices and needs became the center of decision making. And so as you wake up in the morning, the world has become characterized by that. And so what I want you to do is to think about, okay, you got up either today, or if you want to imagine yourself getting up on Monday, you brush your teeth, you maybe read the paper, whatever you do. What do you think would be the first thing that you would notice that would tell you what happened? What happened overnight? Something changed. Just to fuel your imagination, a similar exercise we went through asking a similar question. Someone said, when I looked out of my window at work and I saw this plaza where usually skateboarding is not permitted, young people were skateboarding and it was welcome. So, it might be a very little thing, or it might be something you see in the paper when you read the paper. So I'd be interested in hearing from you, and also hearing if there's anything in the chat about what you think would spark your attention if that something happened overnight. Those that are just coming in, I'm asking people to imagine that overnight decisions had been centered on youth and children's needs, and the world was organized around that, and you woke up, it happened overnight, and what would you notice that would tell you what the heck happened overnight? Okay, microphone.
No, I'm done.
Okay.
Could you repeat it into the mic? I think someone
Nah.
didn't hear you.
No.
No? Okay, you don't have to.
Well, I would notice that the early morning buses taking kids to school were not going by. Mhm.
And children were allowed to sleep in? Okay. Any other thoughts that people have? What might be different?
Dovetailing on that, as I remember getting my kids ready to go to get to daycare or wherever, not having to hustle and bustle in the morning and getting them out the door when they really didn't want to go.
So there was more gentleness on children's readiness to start their day.
I'm hoping what I would notice is that both parents are involved with their children. Not just one parent, but both parents are very involved with their children.
So maybe you'd see that at bus stops and all sorts of places. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
I'm a teacher, so when I got to school, I would see a lot more mental health supports and a lot of smaller class sizes with more other supports there in the classroom to fully meet the needs of all the children who are there.
Piggyback on what Michelle said, I would see that she was able to take time to be with the children in the morning, and that the workplaces would allow women to come to work when they could get there and not have to punch in a clock.
I find that I find your question difficult to answer. It's one thing to think about what it would be like if we were centering our decisions around what's best for children, not necessarily what they wanted necessarily, but what's best for children, or whether we are saying that the children and youth are making the decisions, in which case I think we would have chaos.
All right. Well, that is probably a good jumping off point for us to talk about what this effort is, and what the notion of children's rights is, and how UNICEF is involved, and then how we're thinking about that in Minneapolis. So I'm going to turn it over to Rachel.
Okay, testing. Can you hear me? All right, great. Yes, now it's on. Great. My name is Rachel Peterson, and I'm really happy to be here today. And as was mentioned in the introduction, my interest in children's rights and the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child started back in 2005 when I was a graduate student at the University of Tromsø in Arctic Norway, which was one of the few universities in the world at the time that had a peace and conflict studies program. It was a Master of Philosophy in Peace and Conflict Transformation Studies. And when I arrived in Tromsø as a, how old was I? 23-year-old. I knew that I wanted to volunteer. And so I started kind of doing a little research online and asked some of the students that were in the class ahead of me about volunteer opportunities, and I mentioned that I was particularly interested in young people. And somebody said, "Oh, you should talk to the director of Save the Children, their local regional office, because they do a lot of volunteer work, so, centering children and youth and children's rights." And he happened to be a graduate of my program, which was convenient, and I went and spoke with him and was immediately kind of compelled by this notion of children's rights that I knew nothing about. I had no previous experience or interest in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it sounded kind of obscure to me too. Like, what, like, I've never heard of it, right? I'm an American and I'm in Norway. And anyway, so I learned about it. And whenever I talk about children's rights and the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, and now Child Friendly Cities Initiative, which is this project that Gretchen and I and a number of other people and young people have been working on for some years now, I think it's really important to do just kind of a grounding in what the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is a mouthful, is. And let's see here, maybe this one works. There. Oh, there's our intro slide. So kind of same thing as the previous one. And it starts with this woman named Eglantine Jebb. When I talk to kids about Eglantine Jebb, I always just say, "Isn't that an interesting name, Eglantine? Have you ever heard that name before? Anybody?" No. I believe it's a name for a flower that's like a primrose of some kind. Anyway, Eglantine Jebb was born in 1876 and died in 1928. So didn't live a super long life. Interestingly, she didn't particularly like kids. She didn't have children of her own. But in 1919, she saw in the newspaper, she lived in London, she saw in the newspaper pictures of children in Germany and Austria that were starving and dying because of the blockades that the Allied nations had placed on those countries. And she was just astounded. I mean, these were terrible, horrific photos. And she was a go-getter and a activist and a social justice warrior. I think we could call her that in retrospect. And so she decided that she had to do something about this. And so she printed flyers with those photos from the paper, and she went to Trafalgar Square, and she started handing them out and kind of causing a scene to get people interested in this topic and to understand that what we're doing by blockading is harming these innocent children, right? Children are not actors in war. And she was arrested for doing that. And people they didn't have a capacity, I don't think, to understand where she was coming from at this point in time. And she went to court, and the judge was particularly compassionate and was like, I get it. These are children. And so he paid her fine and let her go. And that was the first donation, they say, to the organization Save the Children, which we now know today as Save the Children International, Save the Children US. It's all over the world. And along with UNICEF, Save the Children and UNICEF are the two global entities in the world that really focus on children and youth rights. That is the groundwork for everything that they do. So after this arrest, and she started the organization Save the Children, she drafted the Declaration of the Rights of the Child, which was a precursor to what we know today as the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which Gretchen is holding up. We have really lovely little purple booklets over there that you can take. There's also a child-friendly little sheet if you want one of these that kind of brings the language of the UNCRC down into kind of child-friendly terms. CRC being Convention on the Rights of the Child. So if you hear us saying UNCRC or CRC, that's what we're talking about. So she submits that document in 1923, the Declaration on the Rights of the Child, to the League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations in 1923, and it's adopted by the League of Nations in 1924. So between 1924 and today, a lot has happened. The League of Nations does not exist anymore, and the United Nations was founded in San Francisco in 1945. And during that time, the League of Nations sort of developed this concept that Eglantine Jebb started, right? This declaration that all children should have, they have fundamental rights, and they are children and youth rights. And this is one of my favorite quotes from her. She says, "I believe we should claim certain rights for the children and labor for their universal recognition so that everybody, not merely the small number of people who are in a position to contribute to relief funds, but everybody who in any way comes into contact with children, that is to say, the vast majority of humankind, may be in a position to help forward the movement. So that's kind of her stance. That's what she declares to the League of Nations. They adopt this thing over many, many years. The declaration kind of evolves into the modern day United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, the UNCRC. Now, this treaty, the UNCRC, is the most ratified treaty in the world. Like it's more ratified than any other treaty, UN treaty or otherwise. And it's ratified by all UN member states except for one. Does anybody know or want to guess which one hasn't ratified the UNCRC? Yeah. Somebody say it. The United States, yes. The United States is the only country that is a member of the United Nations that has not ratified. Somalia has ratified. There are countries that have sort of that currently have governments that are not particularly stable at this moment, and they have managed to figure out a way to ratify this document. The United States is a signatory of the UNCRC, so they're like, we like it, we get it, but not ratified. So that's kind of where it stands currently. 1959, the UN adopts the declaration. In 1989 is when the UNCRC becomes a thing, hooray, and countries start to sign on to it, and then countries start to ratify it. In 1995, US is like, okay, we will be a signatory, still not going to ratify though. And that's sort of where things stand currently. And one of the reasons why Gretchen and I have become really engaged in children's rights is because we see the need for a ratified United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child in the United States. However, that's going to take a lot of effort and work. And in the meantime, there are lots of ways that the CRC is currently living and thriving in the United States. And I would argue particularly in Minneapolis and Houston, the city that like beat us by like a couple weeks to becoming they were the first city to get the child-friendly cities status, candidacy status. We love Houston, they're doing great work, but we came shortly after and we're the second city to become a candidate for this child-friendly cities status. So I'm gonna hand it back to Gretchen and we're gonna tell you a little bit about child-friendly cities and what that is all about. No, not yet. Okay. Or I guess I covered parts of it. Let's see. Yeah, we could talk a little bit about that first. That colorful vision on image on the side there. There's a couple of those posters over there. If any, and there's at least one teacher in the room. I would love for that poster, which is the UNCRC in child-friendly images and language, to be in every classroom in Minneapolis. That is my dream and goal. So the global context, CFCI, which is Child Friendly Cities Initiative, which is this UNICEF initiative, uses the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child as a framework to help local governments prioritize the needs of children and young people and elevate the voices of youth in local governance and decision making.
So in 2019, we were invited to be a group, I think, of 5 or 6 of us from Minneapolis, went to Jacksonville, Florida, to learn about this thing that I had never heard of, Child Friendly City Initiative. And there was a reason that perhaps that had not been in my field of vision. UNICEF USA, because the U.S. had not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, did not have a program, did not have a child-friendly city initiative program, was not promoting it here in the United States. Across the globe, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of cities that are child-friendly cities and have been so since the 1990s. It's a new adventure for UNICEF USA, who had previously predominantly been a fundraising organization, raising money for the international UNICEF, and now has entered into this idea that we have things to do here in the United States as well. and the Child Friendly City Initiative is an expression of that. So, between my glasses and the distance, I might have to turn around. The Child Friendly City Initiative thinks of buckets of goal areas, and these really reflect the types of rights that are laid out in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So, safety and inclusion. Every child and young person is valued, respected, and treated fairly within their communities and by local authorities. So just the right to live in a safe way. Children's participation. So every child and young person has their voice, needs, and priorities heard and considered. They're not the ones driving everything, but heard and considered in public laws, policies, budgets, programs, and decisions that affect them. There are equitable social services. Every child and young person has access to quality, essential social services. There are safe living environments. Every child and young person lives in a safe, secure, and clean environment. And if we think of the work of a child, which is to develop and grow, these are basic infrastructure of doing that. And then finally, it's not just making them safe and secure, but they also have the right to play and leisure, which we know is so important to our mental well-being and really to our inventiveness and discovery. Every child and young person has opportunities to enjoy family life, play, and leisure.
So there are, depending on how you count them, I say there's about 42 articles in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, and pretty much each of those 42 articles can kind of fall under one of these categories. These are kind of the guiding principles for both the Child Friendly Cities Initiative and for the CRC in general. So a timeline. In 1989, Mayor Fraser signs on to the CRC. So this is an example. 1989 is when, if you remember the earlier slide, where that's when the United Nations adopts the UN CRC and countries start signing on to it and then ultimately ratifying it. Mayor Fraser of Minneapolis was keen on this idea, and I think fully aware that it's probably not going to happen at a federal level in the United States, so wanted to do something locally. So a lot of credit is due there for that action to say, we as a city want to adhere to this document. If our country isn't going to, then we want to. And I think that that was a very forward-thinking action. Do you want me to just walk through the timeline? Okay. In 1996, that is when UNICEF launches the Child Friendly Cities Initiative globally. Like Gretchen mentioned, there are like hundreds, thousands of child-friendly cities in the world. And as of today, still technically none in the United States. 2 that are candidates, Houston and Minneapolis, and a bunch more that are kind of in a pipeline for candidacy. But all over the world, there are child-friendly cities. And so that initiative was launched in 1996. Fast forward a number of years, 2019, that's when Gretchen and myself and Dr. Chuck Oberg and Adriana Osorios, who used to work at UNICEF, we went down as, representatives from Minneapolis to this convening in Jacksonville, Florida, where a bunch of child rights activists and interested people gathered and talked about, how do we do this here in the US? We still haven't ratified this thing, but can we adopt this UNICEF notion of child-friendly cities? And there was a lot of momentum and a lot of enthusiasm, and that was kind of the start of CFCI in the United States. And so I personally am very proud of having been at that convening and being kind of one of the, founding members of the initiative here in Minneapolis, along with Gretchen and a couple of others.
So that meeting was enthusiastic but a little chaotic because people didn't really know what this was that we were going to do in the United States. And so as I listened, as Commissioner of Health, I listened for what kind of things are you supposed to do if you're a child-friendly city? And just to say something about that designation, it doesn't mean that this is a perfect place for children. It means that this is a city that has been that is committing itself to being better and better for children. And it's a journey. You become a child-friendly city, and then you need to re-up. You need to show that you're achieving things. You need to show what your next goals are. So it's really a long-term commitment to be a child-friendly city. But as I listened, I thought about what Mayor Fraser had put in motion, what we already had in place. We have something called a youth coordinating board that pulls together the parks, the libraries, the city, the schools, that really looks at and the elected officials from those areas and gets them together to talk about young people and how do we assure that their needs are being met. We have something called a youth congress, which is young people from the city of Minneapolis that come together. Their motto is no decision about us without us. So we have some, ingredients that are in place. We have, the city of Minneapolis has something called a children's cabinet, which is the department heads of the city get together and talk about how are we seeing the needs of children and young people in the work that we are doing, and how could we change it to be better for their growth and development. So with those ingredients and listening to what was going on at that meeting in Jacksonville, we talked in our delegation, and it wasn't even clear what the process was, but I went to the microphone and I said, I think Minneapolis will be one of the first ones to try this out. And so we came back to Minneapolis. We talked to the mayor about it. We talked to the city council about it. They agreed. They were excited about leading in this designation and trying to be, figure out what it was and to be a designee. And so we have moved through the mayor signed a proclamation, I think, in February of 2020, right before we really were in the throes of COVID, and set in motion a formal process to work with UNICEF to become what we are now, a designee. And we were formally acknowledged as a designee this February, I believe. They came here, UNICEF national leadership came here and conferred that upon us because we had done an assessment, we developed a plan, and we're going to tell you about those elements. And being a designee is about a year-long process. You need to kind of work the plan. You need to show that you are making progress, and then UNICEF will decide whether or not you've gone far enough in the journey to become an official child-friendly city.
I don't think we need to read through each of the timeline points since it's been up on the screen. So what do you think? Yeah. No, okay. Do you want to speak to this one? And then I can.
Sure. I think this is sort of what I was talking about. So you have to conduct a situational analysis, which we have done, and we're going to talk to you about some of our local action plan. But the situational analysis, we had young people, youth, gather together in groups and tell us what they see as issues before them and what they would like the city to do. We also gathered young families, so parents of young children, and talked to them about how is life in the city from their perspective. And so that was, and then looked at data, of course, that we had. So conducting that situational analysis and then developing a local action plan out of that, and we'll talk to you a little bit about what's in that. And then implementing the strategies, and then needing to not only have a plan, but monitor and evaluate just how are we doing and do course corrections and so on. So that's the process.
So these are the kind of main featured points or priorities of the Minneapolis Child Friendly Cities Initiative Local Action Plan. And they are emergency management and preparedness planning. And we'll touch on each of these briefly. Youth voice and decision-making spaces, community safety, and child rights education and awareness.
Yep. Oh, I think we've already covered these milestones, right?
Yes, and then the next one is what can we do? I think that's the last.
Oh, okay. Well, we're going to go back and just walk through these each on their own. It's good to be reminded what our slides are. So I'm going to talk about the first one, which is emergency management. So if we think about the kinds of crises that we have had in the city in our recent past, going all the way back to maybe the collapse of 35W Bridge, there was a busload of children, school children on the bus. There was a tornado in North Minneapolis, and many families were displaced. It was very hard for them to continue their daily lives because of the destruction of the tornado. And then we had a fire at the Drake Hotel, which was a hotel that was housing homeless families, and certainly have seen impacts on children and family and schools, mental well-being as a result of COVID, and all the changes that occurred because of that. And as recently as the murder of George Floyd and the disruption, the social disruption, and the effect that that has had on young people. So we know that crises almost universally impact children and families. And even so, as we look at our planning is kind of makes them incidental, or has in the past. They're just like everybody else. You know, we just make sure we go out there with our chainsaws and cut the trees down when the tornado comes. And it's really in the recovery period. So not that crisis time when something happens, but when we all settle down in a week or two, and then for months to come, that really children and family needs are shown more visibly and need to be attended to even as the adrenaline is worn off and people have kind of gotten back to their normal lives. So what we are planning with the with our local action plan in this area is to make children and families a center, or give them a formalized place in the plans going forward. And then there's something that happens amongst those who have responded to a crisis. It's called after action planning. And so afterwards you sit and you ask yourself questions about how did that go, and that's an important process because it leads to improvements in the plan going forward. And so we want there to be specific questions about how did children fare in this? How did youth fare in this? How did families fare in this? Did we do a good job by them? Did we think of them? Were their needs considered up front and not as an afterthought? And how can we improve our planning continuously going forward so that we get better and better at securing children, giving them their rights in a time of crisis?
So the second priority is youth voice in decision-making spaces. And this speaks to the point that you made earlier about, okay, if children and youth are just making all the decisions, there's going to be some interesting decisions made, right? Yes. Especially the younger ones, right? I've talked to hundreds of children and youth about the UNCRC and children's rights. And when I go into a classroom, in Norway, for example, a country that has ratified and incorporated the UNCRC into Norwegian law, which is like taking ratification even one step further, Norwegian kids know quite a bit about their rights and their children and youth rights. And I'll ask them, like, what rights do you have? And they'll say, I have the right to safety, I have the right to health care, I have the right to education. And then, there's always some like, I have the right to all the candy that I want to eat. And I have the right to, do whatever I want, right? Which is what we'd expect, right, from young people. And then we have a conversation about like, along with rights come responsibilities. Like those two go hand in hand. And it's really incredible, even with really young kids, I'm talking like first, second, third graders even, the really kind of deep and profound conversations you can have with them at their own level about the concept of rights and responsibilities. And so there is definitely some funny goofiness in those conversations, but there's a lot of seriousness too. And so the reason why Minneapolis wanted youth voice and decision-making spaces as a priority is because we see a lot of that really excellent work happening in the cities already. The Youth Congress is made up of young people, high school age, that are doing incredible work in meeting on a weekly basis, right? And helping to guide policy. But this is happening in countless other areas as well. Sports teams and local organizations that have, a youth or a child or youth focus, right? Schools are doing this work. So there are three articles, there are more, but there are three kind of key articles in the CRC that are connected to this youth voice and decision making. And I'm just going to read them really quick. Article 12 says that every child has a right to have a say in all matters affecting them and to have their opinions and suggestions taken seriously by the government, school boards, parents, and civil society. I think that part about having their decisions or having their opinions taken seriously is really key because that's on us. Article 13, every child must be free to say what they think and to seek and receive all kinds of information as long as it is within the law. Article 15, every child has the right to meet with other children and join organizations as long as this does not stop other people from enjoying their rights. So one of the ways that Minneapolis is focusing on this is through, would you call it a project, the Youth on Boards initiative, the Youth on Boards project, which has kind of been a long time in the works, a way to get really. Youth are often invited to join boards of different sizes and scopes in sort of a tokenized way, right? Like, I suppose we should have a young person on this board. And the efforts of Youth on Boards, which is a big essential piece of the local action plan for CFCI, is to try to eliminate that tokenism and really actually get youth to be engaged in boards and decision-making processes in the city in much more significant and meaningful ways. Eliminate that tokenism, actually listen to, and a lot of it is on board members to learn how to engage young people in the ways that will help bring out those really meaningful and impactful ideas. Anything else on that you want to? Okay.
There are three committees that have stepped forward. Minneapolis has 50 advisory committees or something like that, but there are three that have stepped forward and said, we'll be in the pilot phase of this. We're going to figure out how to make this work better. And so that's part of the action plan. So the next area is community safety. And when we talk to both the youth and young people, as well as the families of young children, safety was an issue that was brought forward. And as you saw in the list that we gave you from UNICEF and CFCI, the notion of safety is really an important component of this work. The ways that safety presented itself to young people and young families varied by their characteristics. And so the recommendations for this area are really to make sure that as we as a community think about reimagining public safety, and we are doing that after the murder of George Floyd, we're thinking about, what ways do we want our police to work? What other stuff is there that adds to our safety? So as those discussions move forward and evolve, we want to make sure that the voice of young people and young families are there. In the assessment that was done with the group of people that we brought together from those two areas, we did hear that there is a sense of safety that young people have in their schools. And there is a sense of safety that young families have about their daycares. And so those institutions are really important to continue to hold that measure of safety that may not feel as prevalent in the community at large. People have concerns about transportation, safety, and they have concerns about their community safety. And so it's really important for us to hear from young people how it's playing out, and where we can direct our energies that might lead us in places that are a little bit different than we as adults would focus entirely. So that's the focus on public safety.
And then the final principle, number 4, is child rights education and awareness. So there's an article in the UNCRC, Article 42, that summed up says that children have a right to know their rights. They have a right to know the content of this document, which is why it's so important to have child-friendly language. Because if you read the actual language of the CRC, it's pretty like dense with legalese and like UN treaty language, right? So UNICEF has made a beautiful child-friendly version of it. I mentioned earlier that like when I would go into schools in Norway and talk to kids about their rights, they would like raise their hands and tell me all kinds of rights. That doesn't happen when you go into schools in the US, right? Because we haven't ratified it. They don't have this concept of children, their youth rights. And that's sort of what this priority wants to change, right? We want to bring a greater level of awareness to all young people in the city of Minneapolis and then broader in the United States, right, of what their rights are. Because knowing your rights also helps you in all of these other priorities, right? You have, if you have knowledge about something, knowledge is power, right, is the bit of a cliche, but it's true. So this has been happening in Minneapolis for the last couple of years through, for example, this program called Reach Out and Read. Is anyone familiar with this program? It's out of Hennepin Healthcare, right? And it's a nationwide program. And essentially the idea is through well child visits and pediatricians introducing age-appropriate literature to kiddos and through their parents at those well child checkups, which is a time when, you know, most kids hopefully are at least getting in to see their pediatrician at these milestones, right? And giving them a book for free. And so Dr. Chuck Oberg, who's an executive committee member, had this great idea that why don't we have books that talk about children's rights as an option for these pediatricians to hand out during these visits. And that was implemented in part through Dr. Chuck's generosity himself, but also through UNICEF. And so now through this program in Minneapolis, parents are getting these age-appropriate books. Gretchen has one, and I have another version. One is for younger kids, one is for slightly older kids. And those are being distributed to young people and their parents so that the parents can then read to the kids. So Gretchen is going to read a little excerpt from I Have the Right to Be a Child.
So, I have a right to be a child. It's a little hard for me to hold the microphone and the book, so I'm not going to show you the pictures, but they are lovely and colorful. I am a child with eyes, hands, a voice, a heart, and rights. I have the right to a first name, a last name, a family that smiles at me, and a country that I can call home. Oh, you can look at her pictures. All right. I have the right to have enough food to eat and water to drink so that I can grow. My favorite thing is an orange. You can eat it or drink its juice. I have the right to live under a roof, to be warm but not too hot, not to be poor, and to have just enough of what I need. Not more. And I'll stop there.
So this is one of the initiatives of the Child Rights Education and Awareness priority area and committee that sort of focuses on that. There are some other ideas too about how to introduce children's rights into schools. Article 42 says that children have a right to know their rights. In hand with that is that governments are responsible then, if you've ratified the CRC, for making children's rights available and offering education on them, which happens in lots of other countries in the world. So the Child Rights Education Committee that kind of focuses on priority 4 is also really actively thinking about ways to introduce the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child and the concepts of children and youth rights into local schools. So it's just in its kind of infancy, but it's I think a lot of potential and a lot of really great things could happen when when the CRC is more present, including just having those posters hanging on the walls so that kids can read a little bit about their rights.
So, we're going to end with thinking about, so what can all of us make of this? One thing we have started, and we would welcome others to join their voices to, is to talk to our members of Congress about the United States ratifying the UNCRC. Congresswoman Omar has introduced legislation to that effect a couple years ago, and I think will be introducing it again, or has introduced it again in this term, and welcomes interest, I think, because frankly there are a lot of treaties the U.S. has not signed on to, but this is one that we stand out so singularly on. We have also spoken with Senator Smith's office about the need to move forward on this and the local support there is here in Minnesota and the reason to do that. Another thing to do is to connect with schools that your children or your grandchildren or you yourself are connected to, and think about how could this notion of child rights be included either through posters or programming. We are so lucky to have people here that live locally that are national experts on child rights, and so there's plenty of resources to help teachers talk about this in their schools. And then we are creating something called an affiliation status, so you may belong to an organization, and we are just finalizing the process for other organizations to say, you know, I'm kind of working on one of those already, and wouldn't mind having my organization listed as an affiliate of this effort, and might even be interested in expanding our work and thinking about new areas that are also part of the Child Friendly City Initiative. So that's a short list. Hopefully something on there will spark your attention. And now we've got, I think, maybe 8 minutes or so for comments, questions, interaction. 6 minutes.
I guess my first question is, can you speak to, you said that the United States hasn't ratified it, but we've endorsed it or whatever, and I'm sure there's a technical distinction there, but is there any other distinction with that? So speak a bit about that. And then my second question has to do with, so much of this seems to be what's good for the child is good for the family, or maybe I could reverse it. What's good for the family is good for the child, because you had some of the goals on there, and one of them was like every child has the right to live in a safe whatever. If their family doesn't live in a safe thing, I'm sure you wouldn't advocate taking the child away from their parents to live in a safe place. And so I'm wondering how you deal with the broader issue of.
Yeah, I can address the first part of the question about the signatory versus ratifier. Signatory is, it ultimately doesn't hold much. It just says we sort of agree with the principles in general. When you ratify the CRC, you are held accountable to a committee at the United Nations called the Children's Rights Committee, and you have to report. You have to do extensive research and report to them every 5 years, and then you get critiqued, and then you have to show improvements in in the work that you're doing that's child rights based. On an ongoing basis. So when you ratify, there's a commitment to the United Nations to make improvements every single reporting period. I'm not going to get into the reasons why the U.S. hasn't ratified. It has a lot to do with parental rights and some big money, but that's a whole other topic. Gretchen, do you want to address the second part of the question?
Sure. I think really an undergirding principle of these rights and really of human development is that children are best nested in their families. And so the well-being of families is really inseparable from the well-being of children. And so, yes, we recognize that it's not a like a laser pointed kind of initiative. It's a broad well-being initiative.
So a quick question about how do we help? If you are a school who wants materials or a organization who wants to become a partner or whatever, who do you reach out to?
You can reach out to Gretchen or myself. We'd probably be the best points. We're both on the executive committee, and we're both on the engagement committee. I'm on the child rights education committee, so we'd be your best contacts.
Okay, thanks.
So are these rights that you've identified claimed or granted? Who has, have we granted them anywhere or are we claiming them? There's a difference, I think, if you understand.
I think countries that ratify the CRC are claiming them. They're saying these are rights that children and youth have. And so again, when you ratify, then you're held accountable. You have to prove that you are working towards. And the United Nations Committee on Children's Rights, they are pretty fierce in their critique. So like even a country like Norway gets critique every 5 years on things that they need to improve. And they have to then show that they're improving. So they are claiming those rights. Norway is an interesting case study because, like I mentioned earlier, they have not only ratified the CRC, but they've incorporated it into Norwegian law. So where Norwegian law says one thing and the CRC says something different, the CRC is the winner in that contest.
So we come to a close today with this forum, and I want to express our appreciation for sharing your perspectives. Next Sunday, the social justice team will join forces with our community partners team as we welcome Catherine Mears, Executive Director of Avenues for Youth, a program that supports homelessness, youth through stable housing and other services. We look forward to seeing you then.